Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm George Binns, and here with my co-host, Elliot Margolis. And we have as our guest this evening, Brendan Sweeney, who has taken out papers and he's going to run for the city councilor at large for the city of Beverly. Welcome, Brendan.
Thanks, George. Good to be here. Thank you guys for having me.
So we started talking a little bit before the recording started, and we've sent you some ideas of what we think we would like to talk about. And from that list, what's the most important one to you?
I think the most important is the first set of questions, but particularly you guys mentioned my take on the state of the city, but then also where it's going and where it should be going. And if that works for you guys, I'm more than happy to dive right in on that topic. Okay, thank you, George. And so, as everybody knows, the city, Beverly in particular, alongside the rest of the country, is facing an uphill challenge as we work to build back after the year plus that we've been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, it was unprecedented and unexpected, and we had a tough hand dealt. And as we look at both assessing what has happened this past year, as well as working forward for where we want to move the city beyond this pandemic for the next 5 to 10 years, longer term, first, obviously, we have to acknowledge the tangible human impact that the virus has had, as I'm sure both of you, and I know I have known family members and friends and others that have been impacted by the virus. And it's been a tough year on that front, but looking at the city from a larger scale as well, you can see the impact that the pandemic has had on our local small businesses. And in particular, they've been the ones that I believe, as far as sectors of our community, they've been hit the hardest because they've had to deal with the challenges from COVID-19, trying to operate in the environment where operations are generally limited due to COVID restrictions. And they have had to deal with a tough economic climate on top of that. And so as far as the state of the city, that's one area that I'm particularly interested in. As you guys may know, there has been a substantial amount of federal aid to date that has been dispersed to states and municipalities like Beverly to focus on COVID response immediately, but then longer term recovery. And so when I assess the state of the city, that's one area that I'd like to see the administration, the city council, and just the city in general focus on moving forward, is ensuring that that small business community in the city is able to build back as we look forward. But generally speaking, when you factor in how difficult the pandemic has been, Beverly has actually been able to situate itself in a pretty good place, all things considered. Specifically, when you look at the city's financial position, obviously, and this is a credit to the mayoral administration, the current administration, Mayor Cahill's administration, as well as the previous administration, they've done a really good job of building up the city's financial reserves. Specifically, you can look at the stabilization fund, which, more commonly is known as the rainy day fund. It was built up over the last 10 years from a $550,000 balance, which on a budget of $130 million roughly that Beverly has, that's an incredibly low percentage, to the roughly $15 million balance that it was at recently. And so that allowed the city to operate with some level of certainty that services could be maintained going forward. Now, fortunately, the city has also received a fair amount of federal aid tied directly to COVID response and recovery. And so with the combination of those two things, the city's been able to, for the most part, maintain operations without looking at a notable fiscal cliff in the coming, especially fiscal year 22 that's going to be coming forward, as well as fiscal year 21 that we're in currently. And so I think when you assess the state of the city on that end, that's obviously a positive, when 12 or 13 months ago, there was a lot of concern that there would be real tangible budget impacts to the city because of COVID-19, which would result in service impacts to each and every one of us. So on that end, I think we're in a good position, all things considered, to move forward. And then look back to kind of what the original game plan before COVID for the city had been, which was to build off of the growth that our community had seen over the past 10 years or so. And this is another question that you guys had posed, and I think it's relevant when we work more into the conversation about the master plan. That was an opportunity that the city had to put a master plan together, and obviously this was all pre-COVID, to lay out how the next 10 years or how the city would like to see development in our community take place over the next 10 years. And so when you look at that, we are, I think, in a very desirable place as far as Beverly is a community where we have a lot of natural beauty, being right on the ocean. We have close proximity to Boston. I'm a commuter myself. I'm commuting, remotely now, so it's not nearly as long as it was before. But prior to the pandemic, I had taken the commuter rail into Boston every day, and so that was one of the factors that drew me to Beverly, is I'd be able to walk to the commuter rail station and take the train right into Boston. That's a desirable asset that we have as a community that many other cities around us do not. And so with these assets, alongside both our cultural assets as well as the small businesses that make up our downtown and the two universities we have, our colleges, Endicott College and Montserrat College of Art, we're a desirable place for future development. I think developers realize that people want to live in Beverly, they want to work in Beverly. And so with that, I think the city's currently in a very interesting state where we are going to have the opportunity to further develop. And what I would like to see the city council do, building off of the recently approved master plan, essentially, is with more of a collective voice, act on the provisions of the master plan by kind of outlining, as a legislative body on behalf of the community, the types of development that the city would like to see.
Well, that raises the question of what is the character of Beverly? And we've asked this question to several city councilors and different people.
Yeah.
And a lot of this build out of Rantoul Street, and I guess the question is, Cabot Street going to be next? Is this really the character of the city that everybody moved into and expected when they bought their house 10, 15, 20 years ago?
Yeah.
And where's the city really going to go? And are we going to become a suburb of Boston?
That's a good point to bring up, George. And I want to make it clear that I do not see Beverly as a Somerville or a Cambridge or even Salem going forward. I think that's one thing that makes Beverly unique, is we have much more of the kind of characteristic New England town feel than you see alongside those cities that you had mentioned, George, the outer ring of Boston. And now the development that was contained to the end of Rantoul Street by the Depot train station, I think makes sense given that we did need to increase the housing capacity in our city. But I do not think it makes sense going forward when you look at potential areas of the city that are ripe for future development. The one that's on my mind is the area between the Depot and the Bass River. Obviously, you have the same proximity to transit, the Depot train station, that you had with the developments on the other end of the Depot on Rantoul Street. But that's an area where right on the river, you have much more of what I believe would foster a good kind of mixed use approach where we could focus on both expanding our commercial capacity. I think that's something that having, and again, this is all contingent on, obviously, that's most of that area is privately owned. So it's not like this is something that's going to happen overnight. But what I would like to see for that area is a focus on what I've termed workforce housing, as a way to convey the demographic population that we would be targeting, young professionals like myself, working families, and then also seniors who, as empty nesters, are looking to downside, but have had trouble finding an affordable unit to do so. The master plan calls this the missing middle. And what I really see those housing units are as smaller multifamily units that are not 6-story apartment buildings, George, as you mentioned, those that kind of more define the Somervilles and the Cambridges, but are rather smaller buildings where you have maybe four family units in a building, and they fit within the historic character of Beverly, where you think of us as, an older manufacturing New England town. A lot of those buildings that have come to define the history of the city up through the last few centuries are still standing. So I'd like to kind of build off of that character in areas like the Bass River. I don't think that any future development should mirror the last few larger developments that are contained to the one end of Rantoul Street by the depot, if that's what you're asking.
Brendan, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you would bring to the council.
Yeah.
Why you're running.
So to start with the background and then build into the second question there. So a little bit about me. I began my career in public service originally as an intern in the state legislature, but I also interned for the town administrator in Wenham, which then led to my full-time position that I held working directly for the town manager in Reading. And that was a very interesting position. He tasked me with a lot of kind of special projects, but mostly my responsibility was centered entirely around constituent service. And so if you called into Reading Town Hall, or if you showed up with a complaint or a request to see a department about a specific issue, I would be the first person that you would talk to. And I would then have to work with the relevant department to solve the problem of the person who called in or showed up to town hall, or I'd have to figure out myself how best to address the issue. And so that really did attract me to local government longer term, because I think that the one thing that separates local government from definitely the national level, but even so much the state level, is it's very much focused on solving issues. And at the end of the day, there are so many core services that local government provides that impact each of our lives, notably public education for our kids in the school system, but also some more routine services like the provision of clean water, keeping our streets paved and plowed, especially during winters where we can get decent amounts of snow, picking up trash, these type of services that are much less debated on an ideological basis, but focused on how can we most efficiently provide a service for our neighbors and the people around us. And so that always attracted me to local government. And I was fortunate to be able to transition from that position in Reading to work for the state's executive office for administration and finance. I worked as a budget analyst, crafting the state's roughly $46 billion budget, specifically focusing on education, housing, and the economic development portions of the state budget, which were really attractive to me because I believed that those were the area of state policy that most impacted municipalities. And so the COVID-19 pandemic hits, and as a result, our office, the Office of Administration and Finance, had to create a new division focused on COVID-19 response and recovery. And specifically, my position is working with the mayors, town managers, and finance officials from the cities and towns across the state to administer federal funding tied directly to COVID. And that's something that I had referenced earlier during our first question. And it's through that process that I've been able to see firsthand what the issues are at the local level, specifically tied to COVID, and how cities and towns have been able to respond. And I am able to kind of play a role in that process by helping them figure out what federal funding can and can't be used for within the scope of their larger COVID response in their communities. And so that then translates to why I'm running. On that end, I think I do have a very good understanding of how local government works as well as state government. I'm somebody that has been in the weeds both through my time in Reading, as well as my work at the state level. And then also here in Beverly, I've been the chair of the Cable TV Advisory Commission, where we are currently negotiating a 10-year cable TV contract with Comcast. I also have experience on the planning board, although I am the newest member on that board. And then my educational background, I recently, this past spring, graduated from Suffolk University with a Master of Public Administration. And so on that end, I think I can add some real value to the council as somebody that has worked in local and state government and can be an effective advocate for the residents of the city, because I'm somebody that knows which department to go to when they have an issue, because that's essentially what I had done when I was working in Reading. And in addition to this passion for effective local government, that's one of the driving reasons for me to get in the race. I would say there's two other kind of key drivers as to why I wanted to throw my hat in the ring. The first, going back to the state of the city, it's not going to be easy for us to build back coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic unless we take proactive action early on to ensure that our local businesses are able to stabilize their operations coming in these coming months as pandemic restrictions are lifted. As you guys might have seen the other day, Governor Baker has laid out the roadmap between now and August for how the remaining COVID restrictions will be lifted to the point that we'll get pretty close to near normal operations come the end of the summer. I think it's incredibly important that the city do everything they can to ensure that the local small businesses in this community that have had to weather the storm for the last year plus have the resources so that they can, for those that have been closed entirely, successfully reopen, and for those that have been opening under partial capacity or other restrictions, successfully get back to full operations. And I think one benefit of having worked in state government, especially working so closely with federal funding, is I have a very good idea of the tools available that these small businesses can utilize. And I know that groups like the Beverly Main Streets have already done a very good job of helping these businesses find these resources, as well as the mayor's administration. But I do think that's something that the council needs to be proactive in determining. You know, the city will have a pretty large amount of federal funding at its discretion from the recently passed American Rescue Plan Act. Do we potentially put some of that funding towards small business grants, both for the existing businesses, but as well as new businesses? I think that's going to be important in the coming years with the kind of revitalization of downtown and Cabot Street in particular.
What do you mean by a small business grant? Are you actually going to give city money to a private institution?
Well, it's federal money that the city is receiving for COVID recovery. And we're still waiting to see what the parameters of that funding will be. But I think that's potentially something that the city council should be looking at. And it's always important that we assess what are the needs of our city. That's a key role in my mind of the city council is, you know, obviously this is a conversation that happens inside the mayor's office as well. But the city council needs to then bring another perspective of, is there anything that the mayor's administration is missing that we need to be advocating for?
That raises another question. Right now, there's a charter commission going around. And since you've got an MS in public policy and that kind of stuff, what do you think what would you like to see the charter commission come up with? City manager type, or how much stronger do you think the city council needs to be?
So that's an interesting one. As you mentioned, this is something that I'm very interested in. I've followed along with the Charter Commission meetings to date. I attended the public hearing they had a couple of weeks ago. It's interesting. I know there is a lot of debate between professionally managed communities, which are normally towns, although there are a few cities like Lowell and Cambridge that have a city manager, where they very much advocate for the role of a separate chief administrative officer that's appointed. I think in Beverly's case, we have had success with the strong mayor model. The last two mayors in particular, I thought have done a very good job of bringing the city to where it is now. So on that end, I don't think we need to advocate for that sort of wholesale change in the executive composition of the city. You mentioned, so I guess going then to this piece of the city council, on that end, we are a strong mayor city. I think that it's important that our executive has the ability to lead the city as outlined in the charter. And rather than deferring additional powers to the city council, because I do think it's a well-written document as it is. And we've had outside folks like our city council budget analyst, Jerry Perry, confirm that same thinking. It's a well-written document. Most folks that have been around different municipal charters say the same. So I don't think we need to overhaul anything completely. With the piece about the city council having more powers deferred to it, on that end, I think it's important that the city council is ensuring is actively engaging with the mayoral administration throughout kind of the routine actions of government, such as the budget process. The city council has the power there where they can't raise an appropriation, but they still very much have a say in approving the final budget. Do I think that more powers need to be allocated to the city council on that end? No. I think what we need to do in that case as city councilors is make sure that we're working closely with the mayor and his administration to follow along throughout the budget development process and engage with the administration about what their priorities are. And then as city councilors, make sure that we understand where the mayor's coming from, what the needs of the city are, and if there's any changes, what the city council should be bringing to the forefront. So on that end, I think there's room within the role of the city council as it's currently defined to effectively serve as an outside legislative body rather than just, a rubber stamp for the mayor, because the way the charter is composed, the mayor is too powerful.
Talking about the charter for a second, what do you think of changing it so that there be term limits for mayor and councilors?
That's an interesting one. I've heard a lot of folks, and you guys have probably heard this too, when the matter of term limits come up, they say, well, there are term limits. They're called elections.
Yeah, that's a lousy answer, by the way.
That's a tough one. Honestly, I don't think there should be term limits. I think if somebody's doing a good enough job for the city and can continue to make the case that they should stay in the position, then there's no reason that the citizens of that city should not have the right to continue to elect that person to the role. Generally speaking, I do think that change is good and that you don't want somebody sitting in the same role for, 20 years on end. But I don't think that change should be necessitated by a term limit. I would rather see a strong enough field of challengers or folks that are willing to step up and run for elected office to be the reason that somebody is ultimately not elected, because there is another challenger that was able to make a better case as to why they would be the most effective advocate if they were a city councilor or administrator if they're running for mayor versus the current incumbent. It's a good question, though. I'm glad that the city charter is drawn up in the way that it is, where we have mandated 10-year reviews, because I think a lot of municipalities get kind of complacent with how their governing structure is put intact. And so it's not until something happens that necessitates, a citizen petition to form a charter commission that it's ever reviewed. So in Beverly's case, we have to review the charter every 10 years, no matter what.
Well, I guess we get back to the basic question of where is Beverly going? There's a lot of pressure on TOD being on the planning commission. You've seen that. Do we stop with just one railroad station in town being the magnet for Boston and Company? Do we extend that to all of the other railroad stations? MBTA has solved part of our problem that they're shutting down the Pride's Crossing.
Yeah, so we'll go from 5 to 4.
But at the same time, there's a lot of development going on by especially Cummings in the terms of Dunham Road. And there's a whole set of problems that come along with that. Where does the city go? What kind of a balance do we get to between essentially commercial operations, factories, businesses, and residential?
So let me look at this in two pieces. First, to focus on the transit-oriented development. As you mentioned, we don't just have the one train station downtown, Beverly Depot, although that's obviously the one that sees the most activity in the city. There's 5 total. There's going to be 4 when Pride's Crossing is closed down. And to look at, I think it makes sense for the city to utilize its assets, one of the key assets being the commuter rail station, when thinking about future development. Now, that being said, development around the Beverly Depot is going to look different than development in Beverly Farms, even though they both have commuter rail stations. And so this is where I think we can get creative within the frame of trying to push forward multifamily workforce housing that fills a gap in the housing market that the city currently sees, which is a discrepancy between the state-defined affordable housing units that the city's met its 10% stock of. We're at 12% currently, and the higher price luxury units that you've seen in some of the more recent developments. And so what does that look like in a place like Beverly Farms? You're probably not going to see as large of a development in a smaller neighborhood center because it really wouldn't fit with the character of Beverly Farms. Beverly Farms in of itself is almost like a smaller New England town. So
I think the other issue comes up that we've had about a half hour's worth of fun. And there's a few minutes left. Would you like to say something specifically to the audience that you're trying to attract?
sure. And again, thank you guys. As you can tell, I can talk all day about this stuff. But the pitch I'd like, what's that?
You're a politician. You
Yeah.
have to be able to.
Already, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I have that down naturally, huh? What I would say is I believe that I can offer my comprehensive experience in government to effectively hit the ground running as a city councilor who can get things done. My focus is local issues, and I have a background in local government to step right into the fray and immediately get results for the city at such a crucial time where, you know, we really don't have time to waste coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic. And with that, the real driving factor that I haven't really gotten to mention yet as to why I'm running is I'm from the North Shore. I have moved to Beverly fairly recently, but I know the area well. And this is an area that I have decided with my fiance, we'll be getting married at the end of this year. This is where we want to stay, put our roots down, buy a home, and raise a family. So the city means a lot to me, and I believe that I can offer my skill set as a way to give back to the community, to get involved and to really make sure that we build a strong future going forward, building off of the work that we had seen for the past 10 years, even despite the year of hardship that we've had from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, sounds good. And obviously, there's more to discuss about why you're running and what the city's going to do with a new charter and a new plan.
Yeah, it's an exciting time for sure.
Yeah, so it's good. Yeah, it's really an exciting time. I'll leave that. I'll stay out of trouble. And again, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. We will probably continue another discussion with Brendan and with the rest of the city councilors because election season is coming. And thanks for watching. And again, if you have any comments, send them to us. And if you want to join the show, send me an email and we'll make room for you. Thanks again.